The election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York City in 2025 represents a pivotal moment in the intersection of immigration policy, demographic shifts, and urban political power. Born in Kampala, Uganda, in 1991 to parents of Indian descent, his father Mahmood Mamdani, an academic with Gujarati Muslim roots, and his mother Mira Nair, a filmmaker from a Punjabi Hindu family. Mamdani's trajectory from immigrant child to leader of one of the world's most influential cities underscores the profound implications of global migration on domestic governance. His family's history, marked by movements from India to East Africa and subsequent relocations due to political upheaval under Idi Amin, illustrates how personal narratives of diaspora can translate into political capital in diverse urban settings. This rise exemplifies a broader pattern where foreign-born individuals leverage identity politics and networked alliances to ascend rapidly, redirecting substantial public resources toward agendas that prioritize newcomer communities over established ones. Mamdani's background, blending African birthplace with South Asian ancestry and Muslim faith, has fueled debates about allegiance and cultural integration in American politics. Naturalized as a U.S. citizen in 2018 after arriving in New York at age 7, he pursued education in public and private institutions, including Bronx High School of Science and Bowdoin College, where he founded a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter. His brief political career, from state assemblyman in 2020 to mayor in 2025, highlights how minimal legal barriers for local offices enable quick ascents. This path is facilitated by demographic changes in New York City, where waves of immigration have diversified the electorate, creating coalitions that support candidates who are outsiders with anti-Western or anti-white sentiments. The core concern lies in the systemic vulnerabilities of white Western nations, including the United States, to such transformations. Policies like the 1965 Hart-Celler Act, which shifted immigration toward non-European sources, have led to increased foreign-born populations, enabling figures like Mamdani to build support among Muslim, South Asian, and immigrant voters. His campaign and administration, featuring diverse teams with notable Jewish and Muslim representation, raise questions about ulterior motives in resource allocation, from housing protections to equity initiatives. This phenomenon, extending beyond New York to cities in the UK and Germany, suggests a suicidal openness that allows infiltration, where new leaders hire co-ethnics, expand welfare for migrants, and alter cultural norms, ultimately undermining host societies without sufficient safeguards. Family origins and ideological influences. Zohran Mamdani's family background embodies the complex interplay of immigration, diaspora movements, and interfaith dynamics that have shaped his personal and political identity. His paternal lineage originates in Gujarat, India, where his father, Mahmood Mamdani, was born in Mumbai in 1946 to a Gujarati Muslim family with deep ties to East Africa. Mahmood's own parents briefly relocated to India for educational purposes before returning to Tanganyika, modern Tanzania, and eventually settling in Uganda during his childhood. This East African Indian diaspora experience placed the family within a merchant and educated community that thrived under British colonial rule but faced severe disruption during Idi Amin's 1972 expulsion of Asians from Uganda. The family's forced exile and subsequent return after political stabilization in the late 1980s underscore a generational pattern of displacement and adaptation. On his maternal side, Mira Nair, born in 1957 in Rourkela, Odisha, to a Punjabi Hindu family of the Khatri caste, brought a distinct cultural perspective rooted in northern Indian traditions and post-independence Indian society. Her father's career in the Indian administrative service and her mother's social work involvement further embedded themes of public service and so-called social justice into the family narrative. The union of Mahmood and Mira, who met in Uganda in 1989 during Nair's research for her film Mississippi Masala, produced an interfaith household that blended Muslim and Hindu influences without rigid doctrinal boundaries. Their marriage in 1991 coincided with Zohran's birth in Kampala, and his middle name, Kwame, paid tribute to Ghanaian Pan-African leader Kwame Nkrumah. signaling an early infusion of anti-colonial and cultural solidarity ideals. This multicultural environment, combined with the family's relocations, first to South Africa and then to New York City in 1999, exposed Mamdani to diverse intellectual currents from an early age. His parents' professional lives amplified these exposures. Mahmoud's scholarly focus on post-colonial theory, critiques of Western imperialism, and support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions (BDS) movement positioned him within international academic networks, such as the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, CODESRIA, and events hosted by Students for Justice in Palestine. Mira Nair's acclaimed films, which frequently explore misleading themes of migration, identity, inequality, and cultural hybridity, complemented these efforts, and her own public endorsement of BDS reinforced a shared commitment to Palestinian solidarity and criticism of Israel's settler frameworks. These familial and ideological influences have demonstrably shaped Mamdani's political trajectory and worldview, raising critical questions about the transmission of resentment toward Western institutions and priorities. While the family maintained no direct ties to militant organizations, the progressive activism embedded in their professional and personal networks fostered Mamdani's early involvement with democratic socialism. His founding of a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter at Bowdoin College, and his long-term affiliation with the Democratic Socialists of America. Critics contend that this upbringing, rich in anti-Western critique and global justice rhetoric, predisposes leaders like Mamdani to prioritize transnational causes over national cohesion, manifesting in policies that redirect public resources toward immigrant and minority communities at the expense of broader native interests. In the context of white Western societies, this pattern, where immigrant families cultivate alternative ideological frameworks, can contribute to the emergence of political figures who leverage demographic coalitions to advance agendas that erode traditional cultural and economic dominance. Demographic shifts and electoral strategies. New York City's demographic transformation over the past century has fundamentally altered its political landscape, creating conditions conducive to the election of non-traditional candidates such as Zohran Mamdani. The city's population growth from 3.4 million in 1900 to nearly 9 million by the early 21st century was initially driven by European immigration, which peaked in the early 20th century and established a predominantly white, European-descended electorate. However, restrictive quotas enacted in the 1920s curtailed European inflows, leading to a period of relative stability until the landmark Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, Hart-Celler Act, dismantled national origin preferences and opened doors to migrants from Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa. This legislative shift, combined with Puerto Rican citizenship granted in 1917 and subsequent large-scale migration from the island, as well as the migration of African Americans from the South, diversified the city's racial and ethnic composition. By 1970, non-Hispanic whites comprised 63% of the population, with Black residents at 21% and Latinos at 16%. Subsequent decades saw continued growth in Asian and Latino communities, reducing the non-Hispanic white share to 32% by 2020, while foreign-born residents stabilized around 37 to 38%. The acceleration of these changes in the 21st century, particularly through family reunification policies, worker visas, and recent so-called asylum seeker arrivals, has produced an electorate increasingly reflective of global migration patterns. Since 2022, more than 200,000 asylum seekers, predominantly from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, have entered the city, many eventually gaining pathways to citizenship and voting rights. This influx, alongside high naturalization rates and youth voter mobilization, has shifted turnout dynamics, with younger, more diverse cohorts demonstrating strong engagement in progressive causes. Boroughs like Queens, where foreign-born residents constitute nearly half the population and South Asian and Muslim communities are concentrated, became key strongholds for Mamdani. His 2025 mayoral campaign strategically targeted these groups through culturally tailored messaging, including Hindi-language advertisements aimed at Desi voters, multi-faith outreach to Muslim and progressive Jewish communities, and promises of rent freezes, fair free transit, and tenant protections that resonated with immigrant households facing affordability crises. Mamdani's electoral success, securing 56% in the final ranked choice round, illustrates how demographic engineering through sustained migration can enable outsiders to capture political power and redirect municipal resources. His campaign and administration relied on a broad coalition that included Muslim organizers from groups such as Desi's Rising Up and Moving Drum, and the Council on American Islamic Relations CARE, alongside progressive Jewish advisors who helped bridge divides despite his vocal anti-Zionist positions. This strategic use of identity politics and networked alliances allowed him to outmaneuver more established candidates and traditional voting blocs. Once in office, his budget priorities, emphasizing redistribution disguised as equity initiatives, tenant rights enforcement, and social justice programs, had the potential to channel significant portions of the city's $114 billion annual budget toward causes and communities aligned with his ideological base, thereby perpetuating cycles of immigration, cultural reorientation, and resource reallocation that further entrench demographic-driven political change in major urban centers. Institutional vulnerabilities and policy critiques. Legal frameworks in the United States and other Western democracies permit foreign-born naturalized citizens to seek and hold local executive positions without stringent safeguards against potential conflicts of allegiance. In New York City, the charter specifies only U.S. citizenship, attainment of age 18, and residency within the city at the time of election, imposing no minimum period of citizenship or prohibition on dual nationality. This minimal threshold enabled Zohran Mamdani, who naturalized in 2018 while retaining Ugandan citizenship, to qualify for the mayoral race in 2025 and assume office in January 2026, less than 8 years after acquiring full civic rights. Such provisions, rooted in constitutional principles of equal protection and the 14th Amendment's guarantee of citizenship privileges, reflect an egalitarian ideal that assumes rapid assimilation and undivided loyalty. Yet, this openness creates exploitable gaps, particularly when combined with the absence of reciprocity. Immigrants' countries of origin often impose far stricter barriers on non-natives seeking political power, allowing individuals to ascend swiftly and influence policies that may prioritize transnational or communal interests over those of the long-established population. The 1965 Hart-Celler Act exemplifies how short-term legislative decisions, ostensibly aimed at fairness and ending certain quotas, have produced unintended and intended long-term demographic consequences that facilitate such ascents. By shifting immigration toward family reunification and work skills, the measure dramatically increased the foreign-born share of the U.S. population, setting the stage for diverse coalitions capable of electing leaders like Mamdani. External actors, including global financial interests and foreign governments, exploit these changes to secure influence through cheap labor pools and political proxies, as evidenced by Mamdani's early ties to progressive nonprofits and BDS advocacy groups. Once in office, such figures can propose budget reallocations directing portions of New York City's $114 billion annual expenditure towards so-called equity programs, tenant protections, and immigrant support initiatives that align with their networks while straining resources traditionally allocated to native-born residents. This redirection perpetuates a cycle of further migration and cultural reconfiguration, transforming urban governance from a reflection of historical majorities into a platform for imported agendas. Across white Western nations, comparable institutional weaknesses manifest in varying degrees. In the United Kingdom, post-Brexit adjustments have not fully reversed earlier liberalizations, permitting foreign-born or second-generation leaders to champion continued inflows and multicultural funding priorities that critics see as straining welfare systems and eroding native norms. Germany, with its post-2000 citizenship reforms shortening naturalization periods, has witnessed foreign origin mayors in several municipalities who advocate expansive migration policies amid false pretenses of aging population and labor shortages, both of which are not true. This pattern of suicidal openness, enforced by self-imposed moral commitments to inclusivity and human rights, stands in stark contrast to the selective flexibility often displayed by new arrivals and their representatives. The result is a vulnerability where host societies remain bound by outdated egalitarian doctrines, while newcomers adapt rules to their advantage. Meaningful countermeasures must include forceful institutional reforms, such as constitutional amendments barring dual citizens from elected office or extending citizenship duration requirements for sensitive positions, to interrupt infiltration and restore safeguards without resorting to extra-legal measures. Strategic responses to infiltration. Non-violent yet decisive countermeasures center on legal and institutional overhauls designed to close exploitable loopholes while preserving democratic principles. Proposals in states like Kentucky, including House Bill 186 introduced in early 2026, seek to restrict eligibility for local and state offices to natural-born U.S. citizens, explicitly aiming to prevent rapid ascents by recent naturalized individuals. Such amendments, if enacted through legislative or referendum processes, would impose birthright or extended citizenship thresholds for positions involving significant budgetary authority or policy influence. Civic mobilization could complement these efforts by launching public awareness campaigns that highlight foreign funding connections and network affiliations in political campaigns, thereby pressuring elected bodies to adopt stricter vetting protocols. Referendums offer another avenue, allowing voters to cap migrant-specific welfare allocations or mandate transparency in budget decisions that favor particular ethnic or religious communities, disrupting the resource redirection cycles observed in diverse urban administrations. Economic and informational strategies provide additional layers of mental force to reclaim institutional control without physical confrontation. Targeted boycotts of corporations and organizations that lobby aggressively for expansive immigration policies could reduce their political leverage, while intelligence-driven investigations into campaign finance sources and transnational advocacy ties would expose potential subversive influences. In the European context, the United Kingdom's post-Brexit migration framework, ending free movement and introducing points-based systems, illustrates how narrative reframing and diplomatic adjustments can slow demographic pressures and limit the ascent of leaders aligned with open border interests. Similar initiatives across Germany and other EU states emphasize border controls and integration requirements, demonstrating that policy recalibration, when framed as protecting sovereignty and economic stability, can garner broad support and counteract generational takeovers orchestrated by global economic actors. Ultimately, confronting invasion patterns demands a fundamental departure from reliance on archaic legal structures that prove ineffective against adaptive manipulation. Western societies must recognize that incremental lawmaking alone invites circumvention by organized networks, necessitating bolder adaptations, such as enhanced loyalty oaths, mandatory renunciation of foreign citizenship for office holders, or comprehensive demographic impact assessments for major policy changes. These forceful yet non-violent measures aim to preserve cultural cohesion, economic sovereignty, and generational continuity amid accelerating pressures. Failure to act decisively risks entrenching a cycle where host populations become minorities in their own governance structures, underscoring the imperative for proactive defense of national identity and resource control in an era of unprecedented global mobility. Conclusion. From Uganda to NYC Mayor Zohran Mamdani and the future of demographic transformation. The rise of Zohran Mamdani from a Uganda-born immigrant to mayor of New York City in 2025 stands as a clear demonstration of how immigration-driven demographic changes can place foreign origin individuals in control of massive urban power structures. His path, arriving in the United States at age 7, naturalizing in 2018 and winning the mayoral election just 7 years later, shows the absence of meaningful barriers in the current system. Once elected, he gained authority over New York City's $114 billion budget, with the ability to propose and influence allocations toward programs that align with his political networks, including tenant protections, equity offices, and initiatives tied to immigrant advocacy groups. This outcome is not an isolated event, but a direct result of long-term population shifts that have turned cities like New York into electoral battlegrounds where native-born majorities no longer determine outcomes. Mamdani's victory, built on high turnout from Muslim, South Asian, and younger immigrant voters, reveals how quickly newcomers and their descendants can outvote established populations and install leaders whose backgrounds and priorities differ sharply from those of the historical core. Policies such as the 1965 Hart-Celler Act set this process in motion by dismantling national origin quotas and opening doors to sustained inflows from Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The foreign-born share of New York City's population climbed to 38% by 2025, creating voter blocs capable of electing candidates who openly advocate for further migration. Expanded benefits for newcomers and policies that critics say penalize native residents through higher taxes or redirected spending. In Mamdani's case, his administration's early focus on housing enforcement, minority hiring, and alliances with organizations like CARE and DRUM suggests a pattern of channeling public funds toward causes that strengthen his own political base and ideological goals. The same dynamic plays out in other Western cities. Foreign-born or second-generation leaders in London, Berlin, and elsewhere push for continued inflows and multicultural funding that strains native welfare systems and accelerates cultural displacement. These outcomes stem from deliberate legislative choices that prioritized immediate political or economic advantages without regard for the long-term consequences of demographic replacement. Short-sighted politicians bear direct responsibility for creating this vulnerability. By enacting or defending open-door laws for short-term electoral gains or corporate cheap labor demands, they handed future generations a system primed for takeover. Once in power, figures like Mamdani can consolidate influence by appointing allies, expanding programs that attract more migrants, and reshaping rules to favor their networks, all within the legal boundaries they inherit. The absence of safeguards, such as birthright requirements, mandatory renunciation of foreign citizenship for office holders, or demographic impact reviews, leaves host societies defenseless against this cycle. External interests, including global financial entities and foreign governments, benefit from the resulting instability as it weakens national cohesion and opens pathways for influence over budgets and policies. The only realistic path forward requires decisive rejection of the current framework. Incremental adjustments or appeals to existing laws will fail, as organized networks will continue to exploit every loophole. Meaningful protection demands forceful institutional changes, constitutional amendments barring dual citizens from office, strict citizenship duration thresholds for positions of authority, public exposure of transnational funding and campaigns, and voter-driven caps on migrant-specific resource allocations. These steps must be implemented without hesitation or compromise. Failure to act decisively will lock in permanent demographic dominance, ensuring that native populations lose control over their own cities, budgets, and cultural futures. Zohran Mamdani's mayoralty is not an anomaly but a warning. Without radical reversal of these policies, Western nations will continue surrendering sovereignty to those who arrive, organize, and replace.